I'm away visiting my grandkids as this is being released, so I had to cram an extra video into the making in the last 2 weeks. Thus, this one is a bit shorter. In this video, Dr. Ben Shaw covers 8 reasons that you can trust the New Testament. I will only be covering one here. One is all I've listened to, and goodness, does he rely heavily on what he claims Dr. Ehrman has said. Let's have a chat. Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me, and especially to my patrons and channel members. I'll let Sean McDowell introduce his guest.
From careful copying to archaeology to non-Christian sources, we have good reason to believe the New Testament is reliable. Our guest today, Dr. Ben Shaw, has written an outstanding, excellent new book called Trustworthy, 13 Arguments for the Reliability of the New Testament.
Dr. Shaw's book covers 13 points. Sean covers 8, and today I'm doing 1. Let me know if you want me to cover more of Dr. Shaw. We start with copies.
Before we get to our 8 arguments, maybe tell us why you wrote this book and what you think makes this book different or unique.
Okay, yeah. So part of it has to do with my backstory. Is I got saved at a young age when my babysitter took me to church, and I heard the Sermon on the Mount, recognized Jesus as Lord. Just hearing his commands on love were incredibly powerful. Had some oases along the way, but really wasn't discipled for a long time.
Discipled is Christianese for schooled in the faith, or in some cases, indoctrinated. Considering he was young enough to need a babysitter at the time, had he been discipled then, he would have been indoctrinated, as giving critical consideration to the ideas that he was receiving would have been beyond his abilities, which, in my opinion, is the reason Christians push to reach children when they are young, so that they can be indoctrinated before they develop the reasoning ability to realize it's all impossibly contradictory, illogical, impossible, and generally incompatible with reality. This is the reason behind Train Up a Child. One need only look at the lack of success of street preachers to see that their message has little appeal to one with the reasoning ability to confront it.
We're okay. No? You believe?
Most adult converts are so because of an experience of being reached at a time of deep distress. One tends to overlook the implausibility of the message when one's physical needs are being met by the one delivering the implausible message.
And so I had a bunch of questions about Christianity. I'm from South Florida, Fort Lauderdale.
He's from Florida, the Bible Belt. For those outside the U.S., that's a region in the country where Protestant beliefs play a major role in social and political views. I also live in the Bible Belt. It's why on Sunday morning at 10 a.m. I can get the neighborhood pool all to myself, for the most part. I swim laps, so I prefer to swim when kids aren't around to get in the way. Sunday morning at 10 a.m. is heathen swim.
We had 4 million people in our county, so that's 4 million different worldviews, all sorts of different, theories on what life is, how we should live, and all that kind of stuff.
Interesting, only 37% of the people in Fort Lauderdale identify as Christian. Maybe I should retire in Fort Lauderdale, as I'll find plenty of fellow believers and plenty of water to swim in. As you can see from this data from the U.S. Census, I live in one of the most religious states in the country. Only Utah, the hometown of Mormons, has us beat. Although Pew Research has Alabama as number 1, with Mississippi as a close second.
Not being discipled, I kind of got tossed and turned by every wind of doctrine a little bit.
Understandable. You were a child. I was worried about being tossed by every wind of doctrine well into my college years.
A long, weird story is eventually hockey took me to Liberty.
I don't have much respect for Liberty University, a university run by hypocrite presidents, like the son of founder Jerry Falwell, caught, and I use the term loosely as he posted this on social media himself, with his mistress and his pants open. The excusagism flew, but Falwell did end up resigning in an agreement reached with the university. The university got another black eye just 5 months ago when it was fined $14 million, the largest fine of its kind in history, for failure to report sexual abuse on campus. Yeah, don't go to Liberty. Sexual assault is given a free pass there. Dr. Josh Bowen got his undergrad degree there, but he then went on to Princeton for his PhD, where he got his priorities in theology straightened out to coincide with reality. Yes, he is an atheist. Did Dr. Shaw get his entire education at Liberty?
Um, but when I went there, it was my fifth college.
Your fifth college? His BS is in marketing, but he doesn't say where he got that from. How many schools did you go to before you got your undergrad degree, and why?
I found out you could ask questions about God, and they took them very seriously. And so I started asking a bunch of questions. And in the process of that, by the way, for example, when I said I wasn't discipled, when I came to Liberty, I learned Paul wrote half the New Testament. That was kind of a big deal. I was like,
Wow.
oh my goodness, I Romans, I'm looking at totally different now. So it was very important and impactful for me.
Wow. How do you say, I never read a Bible before without saying, I never read a Bible before? When I became a believer at 16, no one discipled me either. I didn't get that until I went to college. When I went to church, I felt like I was so far behind. All these kids knew the Old Testament stories and could quote verses from the New Testament that I'd never heard. I set out to make up for lost time. I read the entire Bible in 8 months. I did skip most of the Psalms as I found them repetitive, and I wasn't going to learn any background information from them. I did hit the Psalms on my second go through in reading the Bible. But seriously, dude, you must not have been very connected to a church to not feel that you needed to crack open a Bible once in a while. Did you even go to church? My experience of going to church in the Bible Belt is pastors encouraging everyone to bring a Bible and read along during the service. Only in my last year or two did I quit bringing a paper copy and start using my phone. The background info isn't helping. Let's skip to the first point.
These 12 different arguments were something that I was very, I wish I would have known without having to come to Liberty or without having to go get a graduate degree.
Indeed, if the average believer has no reason to think the Bible to be reliable without getting a graduate degree, then most people have no foundation for their faith. And that has been my experience in talking to believers. Most, but certainly not all, don't know why they believe what they believe.
This might be the best book I've seen that says here's the breadth of scholarship from canonicity to authorship to textual criticism in one book brought together that is helpful to somebody who's new. But every chapter, there's like one or two things I'm like, oh, that's a fresh way of looking at this, even though I've studied this, was helpful to me.
So the primary audience for the book is someone who is new. New to what? I assume the faith. It isn't a children's book, so not new to life. But most believers become believers as children, so new to the faith doesn't seem to quite fit either. Maybe new to looking into why you believe? That would make sense. But regardless, it doesn't sound like it was meant for us, the unbelievers. Why not? Is it only sufficient to reassure the believer, but insufficient to convince the unconvinced? The reviews bear this out. This review from RJ says it's the first book on apologetics that, we don't have any pronouns, he, she, they, have ever read. Not sure how they know it's good when they have nothing to compare it to.
And the first chapter is on New Testament textual evidence. So maybe explain what you mean, how this advances the argument and some of the evidence itself.
Right. And yes, the first chapter on the textual criticism, it's probably the most difficult chapter. And so for those, if you start reading it, you're like, oh, this is tough. After that, it's very easy to understand.
Sounds like I picked the best point to go with. I prefer a robust study rather than the drivel that usually comes from the easy-to-read packages. Let's dig in.
I was talking, my wife's reading the book, and we were talking through that. As academics, we don't always get our wives to read our work. So,
Dr. Shaw, are you going to join Braxton Hunter and claim that women can learn these things?
Because I think this is a battle cry for mothers. I believe they can learn these things. I believe they can learn these things.
Do the husbands of academics read their works? If they don't, and this holds for the wives of academics as well, maybe it's because they aren't interested in the subject matter. Since this is a book for lay people, and a beginner lay person at that, this comment comes off as rather condescending to your wife, as well as to the wives of other academics. On your behalf, my apologies to your wife.
We were talking through that, and so getting to understand some of the textual arguments sometimes can be tricky just because of the nature of what it is. And what we're really arguing is, are the words in the New Testament the actual words that were written down originally?
Indeed, if the words in the book you call the Bible are not the words that the original authors wrote, you lose your inspiration and inerrancy claims. Some scholars claim that the Bible to be inerrant in the form we have it today, which can't possibly be true, as the book itself tells you so, with footnotes indicating a few of the textual changes made by scribes. The biggest change is the addition of the long ending of Mark, which modern Bibles acknowledge most likely wasn't in the original work. But there are many that are not noted in the footnote. The story of the woman caught in adultery is another large addition, and this one also is noted in most Bibles as not being in the oldest manuscripts. But somehow I missed that. I didn't realize that until I was an atheist, and no pastor that preached on that text ever bothered to bring it up. Why do you suppose that is? But note that the text says it isn't in the oldest manuscripts. It doesn't say it isn't in the original manuscripts. And that's because we don't have any of the original manuscripts. We have no way of knowing what is in them. But I'm getting ahead of Dr. Shaw here.
How many copies do we have, the amount of copies, and then the age of those copies? Because we want to see how they stand up to critical scrutiny.
Cool. And nitpicky grammar point, it's the number of copies, not the amount of copies. Copies is a count noun, not a mass noun. Word is even trying to correct my script as I'm writing this. The number of copies doesn't impress me. Yes, the Bible has been the best-selling book of all time. But that just makes it popular. It doesn't make it true or reliable. The Count of Monte Cristo and The Lord of the Rings are two of the best-selling books of all times as well. There are millions of copies of these. It doesn't make them true. The date of the copies is far more important. If you have many early copies, you are more likely to have a more accurate representation of what was in the originals, even if you don't have the originals.
Because if we don't know what the original words were, how can we even know they were reliable?
Indeed, you can't.
We have to know what they said in order to test to see whether those claims are reliable or not.
Do you have to know what the originals said? Because you can't. You don't have any of the originals. How close are the copies that you have to the originals? That's anyone's guess. I know you feel they are close enough, but I do not. My primary reason for this conclusion is that the God that allegedly wants you to know that this is his inerrant word allowed the originals to be lost and left humans to try to piece together what they said based on copies that other humans who didn't get the inspiration of divinity in making their copies made. Worse, the claim of inspiration that is the basis of all the Bible's inerrancy is based on a single verse in a book that is a forgery. It's in 1 Timothy, which the consensus of Bible scholars say that we don't know who wrote this book, despite the book claiming to be written by Paul. The author, who wasn't Paul, claimed to be Paul to get apostolic authority for his work, which is the definition of a forgery. A forgery is a lie, or at least is written by a person known to be lying to you. When this is the basis for your claim of inerrancy, you have nothing on which to base that claim. That a perfect God would choose to reveal himself in such an imperfect book, to me, is a contradiction of character that I cannot overlook.
New Testament critics, textual critics, that is, they will use the same tests that we use for other ancient writings like Plato or Homer. And so we actually compare Plato and Homer with those of the New Testament.
Agreed, the tools used for the field of study were only discovered about 200 years ago, which is why textual criticism is a relatively new field of study, and why the authorship of textual changes were not studied until relatively recently.
N.T. Wright has that great saying where Homer is the Old Testament for the pagan world, and Plato's the New Testament. So, what a good comparison we could use to compare with the New Testament evidence.
I could not find where N.T. Wright ever said that, but sure, why not?
And so when we look at the evidence for Homer and Plato, we see there's about the recent counts, I believe, are up to about 2,000 copies for Homer's writings, and I'll say about 225, 250 for Plato. And when it comes to the New Testament, there's at least 5,000 copies.
But you told us earlier you were going to discuss the dates of the copies. Here, I'll do it for you. How many copies do we have of the New Testament that date to the 1st century? 0. We have 0. How many manuscripts do we have that date to the 2nd century? We have 4 fragments. 2 from the Gospel of John, chapter 18, 1 that contains Matthew 21, verses 34 to 37 on the front, and traces of verses 43 and 45 on the back. The 4th has a few verses from Revelation. No full manuscripts, just 4 fragments. Additionally, there are 6 manuscripts that might possibly date to the late 2nd century, or possibly the 3rd. Of these, P46 contains portions of Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st Thessalonians, and Hebrews. This is the most extensive early copy that we have. But it's not until the 4th century that you get the first manuscripts that are complete or nearly complete in the codices Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. There is a span of 300 years between when Jesus allegedly rose and when we have our first complete copy of the books your God allegedly wants us to accept as his revelation of himself. It's not until the 10th century, nearly a millennia later, that we have more than 200 copies being produced in a single century. So please, Dr. Shaw, talk about the dates of the manuscripts, as you said you would.
So and this isn't some conservative count. This is widely recognized by scholars of all stripes, including Bart Ehrman.
Yes, these copies exist, with 94% of them made nearly or more than a millennia after the originals were penned.
He's got we have some good quotes from him in the book that highlights, the amount of script of textual evidence we have is far more than any other ancient writing.
Cool. Are you going to produce that quote or just claim to have it?
Full stop. Like that's it right there. And so that's just in the Greek. That doesn't even count the other languages.
I guess not. I have to find it myself. No source material, just the bare claim that Dr. Bart Ehrman said this. Since I have no source, I can't find the exact quote, but I did find what Bart Ehrman said on the topic in his blog. Dr. Shaw isn't wrong, but what Ehrman says about that is hardly supportive of his point. I quote, "For some classical authors, we have only 1 manuscript, or a dozen, or if we're lucky, 100. In some very lucky cases, such as Homer, we have hundreds of manuscripts, though never 1,000. And for the New Testament, we have over 5,560 manuscripts, just in the original Greek. Way, 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 way more than for any other classical author. And so, as Dan puts it, for the New Testament, we have an embarrassment of riches. Since we don't doubt what these authors wrote, why are we creating special problems for the New Testament authors and claiming that we can't know what they wrote? Let me just make 3 points about this claim. First, it is not true that scholars are confident that they know exactly what Plato, Euripides, or Homer wrote based on the surviving manuscripts. In fact, as any trained classicist will tell you, there are and long have been enormous arguments about all these writings. Most people don't know about these arguments for the simple reason that they are not trained classicists. Figuring out what Homer wrote, assuming there was a Homer, there are huge debates about that, as my brother, a classicist, sometimes says. The Iliad was not written by Homer, but by someone else named Homer, has been a source of scholarly inquiry and debate for over 2,000 years. Second, and more important, just because we are worse off for the other authors than for those of the New Testament, does not in itself mean that we can trust that we know what the New Testament authors wrote. I am a lot stronger than my 5-year-old granddaughter, but I am still not able to bench press a half-ton truck. Yes, but you are many times stronger than her. It doesn't matter. I'm nowhere near strong enough. We have far more manuscripts of the New Testament than for any other ancient writing. But that doesn't mean we can know what the original said. We don't have nearly enough of the right kinds of manuscripts, leading to my 3rd point. Third, even though we have lots and lots of manuscripts, the vast majority of them are comparatively late in date, not the kinds of manuscripts we would need to know with any confidence that we have a very, very close approximation of the original text. 94% of our surviving Greek manuscripts of the New Testament date from after the 9th Christian century. That is 800 years after the so-called originals. What good do these late manuscripts do us? They do us a lot of good if we want to know what text of Mark, Paul, or 1 Peter was being read 800 years after the originals were produced. But they are of much less value for knowing what the authors themselves wrote 8 centuries earlier. Dr. Shaw, context matters. Your
Full stop. Like that's it right there.
leaves one with the impression that this was the end of what Ehrman had to say. You aren't trying to mislead your audience by misrepresenting Ehrman now, are you?
So that's just in the Greek. That doesn't even count the other languages.
Manuscripts in other languages don't help your case. These are translations of the copies. They impose an extra layer of interpretation by someone having had to translate them. Their existence is evidence of the popularity of the Bible, but not its accuracy or reliability.
So you put right here on page 13, I thought this was really helpful. It says Homer, or the Homeric tradition, dates to around the 8th century BC. And like you said, roughly 2,000 copies. The date of one of the earliest papyrus fragments of the Iliad is as early as the 4th century. So about 2,000 copies, 400 years later. You look at Plato, this says, somewhere between 210 and maybe 275 manuscripts based on how you count it. And then you have a quote in here that says the oldest sources for the text of Plato are written in the 2nd or 3rd centuries AD. So we're talking 500 years roughly past the time. And this says, as one classicist put it, these copies are closer to us than to him. Now, what I appreciate is you're not saying this means Homer and Plato are not reliable. In fact, you think we can largely trust them as historically copied documents.
Why? As I just read you from Bart Ehrman's blog, the classic scholars don't accept that position. They debate what really is the original writing and who the original authors, just like the New Testament. Could it be that you accept these as reliable just to bolster your claims for the reliability of the New Testament? Because to admit that scholars don't take them as reliable is to admit that there is no standard of reliability against which to measure the New Testament.
But if we just compare the New Testament to the number and dating of these other sources, the New Testament kind of stands in a category of its own.
And why do you suppose that is? Could it be because in the Middle Ages, the period in which 94% of these copies were created, Christianity was both the religious and political power? That no other works were permitted? The classical works were being destroyed by the church because they allowed no other works except that which agreed with their theology. The historical context in which all of these copies were made also matters.
Absolutely, and we're just comparing it to how we look at other ancient other historical works. Plato and Homer, everyone is familiar with them, and so if we don't have any questions with them, we definitely shouldn't have any questions about the New Testament textual evidence.
Except that we do have questions about them. Could it be that you don't know that because your understanding of these works comes from high school where such things are not discussed? Perhaps it would be best to see what the classicists have to say rather than representing a position you clearly have not researched. Kind of like going to a Christian college and not knowing that Paul was believed to have written half of the New Testament.
Even Ehrman himself, he's the leading textual critic, between him and Dan Wallace, they're the top 2 leading scholars on New Testament textual criticism. And they're on different sides of the coin. One's a skeptic and the other's a believer. And even Ehrman says it's no question that there's more textual evidence for the New Testament.
Yes, and in case you were wondering about the reference to Dan in the quote I read earlier, that is the same Dan Dr. Shaw is referencing. Dr. Ehrman was talking about a debate he had with Dan Wallace. And since Dr. Shaw is aware of Dr. Ehrman coming to a different conclusion than Wallace, despite agreeing with the number of manuscripts for the New Testament is greater than that of other ancient works, could it be that Dr. Shaw is also aware of the context, and that Dr. Ehrman in no way thinks the number of manuscripts supports Dr. Shaw's conclusion? If he does, he is misleading his audience by omission. If the only way to make his side look credible is to omit the evidence of the other side, that is evidence of a weak case indeed. A good attorney will always present the other side's evidence first if given the opportunity. That way they control the narrative of how the bad information is introduced. It also scores credibility points with the jury that you are being open and honest with them about the weaknesses of your case, as well as giving them its strengths. Dr. Shaw shading what Dr. Ehrman said to try to make it support his case when it doesn't, for me, destroys Dr. Shaw's credibility and makes me question if he really believes his own argument. If he did, he should be able to tell us both the strengths and the weaknesses and tell us why he comes down on the side that he does. That he has to omit the opposing view to make his look credible is a sign of a lack of conviction, as well as a sign of a lack of convincing evidence.
And I heard Ehrman one time on a podcast years ago. Is such a funny line, and I kind of borrow from it a little bit. But he's asked by an atheist. He's like, if we're looking for all these textual changes in the New Testament, where's a good place we can look? And Ehrman goes, the Bible. If you just look in your footnotes, they usually identify somewhere, hey, this is or is not in one of the earlier manuscripts. So sometimes you'll see it bracketed in the footnotes.
Yes, sometimes you do see that. Why do you suppose that a God that wanted you to know truth would allow that to happen to his allegedly inerrant book? Or does your God not care about you knowing truth? Did he want to throw a bunch of half-truths at you and leave you to sort it out for yourself? Why does this please you? How do you not see what that does to the idea that your book is supposed to be the word of a perfect God? How could a perfect God leave you with such an imperfect book and say, close enough? Is that what he will do on Judgment Day? The book was only close enough, so if he kind of sort of believes, that's close enough too. If your book is to be believed, that isn't the case. But since the book isn't that precise, how could one possibly know?
So it's a pretty interesting distinction there. So if there are questions, you just go to the Bible. So it's nothing new in that regard. We've known about the textual evidence and how well attested the New Testament is for a while.
Or rather, the lack thereof.
It is interesting. You probably quote Ehrman more than anybody else in this book. And as far as I can tell, reliably and carefully and accurately, not out of context.
Sean. I have considered you to be one of the more honest and straightforward apologists. Let me guess. You didn't look at the context. Or you just took Dr. Shaw's word for it. Is that what happened? You might want to check the context yourself next time because this statement hurts your credibility as well.
To just say, even Ehrman agrees with me on this general point I'm trying to advance about, fill in the blank with these different evidences.
Except he doesn't. Yes, he agrees with you on the number of existing manuscripts, but that's it. That is the only point of agreement you have here. You have no agreement on what that means. But to claim that Ehrman agrees with you on this point is a serious mischaracterization. The only thing he agrees with you on is the number of manuscripts, which, I have pointed out, is due entirely to the church burning the classical works in the Middle Ages to destroy anything that wasn't supportive of Christianity. When the defendant destroys the prosecution's evidence, the defendant doesn't then get to claim victory for having more evidence. Especially when, as Ehrman points out, the type of evidence you have, the lateness of the majority of the existing manuscripts, and the accuracy of the classical literature is as much in dispute as the Bible, leaves the preponderance of the evidence still against any way to know if your New Testament is accurate or not.
Now, really quickly, before we move to the next one, what do you do with variant?
He's almost done, and he hasn't even mentioned the dates of the manuscripts, as he promised he would. Dr. Shaw told us that the dates matter.
How many copies do we have? The amount of copies, and then the age of those copies, and the age of those copies, and the age of those copies.
Dr. Shaw told us that the dates matter. The closer in time the existing manuscripts are to the original writings, the more likely they are to be found accurate. Yet despite making that claim, one which I agree with, by the way, he never gave any dates for the existing manuscripts. I had to fill those in for him. Could it be because he knows that the dates are not early for 96% of them? Could it be once again he is withholding what he knows doesn't help his case? Or has Dr. Shaw really never looked at the dates of the manuscripts? Is his work so sloppy that he merely accepted the number of manuscripts that he was told existed without even checking as to when the manuscripts date?
Across the different manuscripts, there's hundreds of thousands. In fact, Peter Gurry has said just in Greek manuscripts, non-spelling differences, he estimates about 500,000 differences. So how would you approach these kind of variants?
Yep, it's widely agreed that the overwhelming majority of the differences are just spelling issues. So, and that makes sense. Like if you think about how many spelling issues we make when we're typing up something using a typewriter with spell check, no typewriters, no spell check. Back then, you're just doing everything by hand, and so you can see how easy it would be to make those sorts of mistakes. And that's the overwhelming majority of mistakes.
Dr. Shaw, did you not hear the question? Sean specifically excluded spelling issues in the number of variances he brought up.
I highlight four different variants or different differences, types of differences. And the one that most people are probably interested in are the ones that are meaningful and significant.
Yes, that would be the case. Most of us are not concerned with the insignificant and that which has no meaning.
And so those are the ones that are going to say something different and then that there's a reasonable question about it. An example of one that is meaningful but not viable is there's a text in Luke that says, if you suffer and are persecuted, you are blessed.
You just admitted we aren't interested in this, so why are you bringing it up? To his credit, this could be a play of fairness. He could be bringing it up to show that he is aware of the differences that make his Bible look pretty bad. This is accepted as an error as it doesn't make sense in the context. But while this may help Dr. Shaw's credibility, I don't think it does so for the Bible. The fact that we know these kinds of errors creep in, some through accidental changes and some through deliberate changes, they clearly show that God doesn't care if people change his book, despite his protestations otherwise. When we can find changes like this because of contextual clues, how many changes are there that we cannot detect because there are no such contextual clues for us? This is something we will never know. And this is another example straight from Dr. Ehrman's work. Dr. Shaw sure seems to like Dr. Ehrman, despite disagreeing with his conclusions.
In Mark 16, 9 through 15, that's widely considered, that's one of the bigger sections. Most differences are only about 2 verses or less long, if that. But that section, that's a section that creates some questions for the New Testament critics. But as we talk about in the book, not only can we find those verses elsewhere in Scripture that are well attested, there's no, to quote both, I believe, Ehrman and Wallace, it makes no change to any traditional or orthodox Christian doctrine.
It doesn't? How about the fact that without it, there are no post resurrection appearances in the text? Resurrection appearances and any witnesses to a resurrection would be a later addition if, as is the consensus of most believing scholars, that the long ending of Mark was added later. Incidentally, I don't mean to imply that believing scholars think resurrection appearances and witnesses to a resurrection is a later addition to the story of Jesus. Most believing scholars, while they agree that the long ending of Mark was added later, they don't see the addition of the resurrection appearances as a later addition to the story. Rather, they see it as a contemporaneous or nearly so writing that merely stresses different parts of the story. Whoever tacked on the longer ending of Mark likely did so to line it up better with what was in the other Gospels. That the verses are very similar to what is found in the other Gospels attests to that. Thus, I don't find their being similar to what is in the other Gospels as being an affirmation of the accuracy of them, especially since the long ending of Mark also adds one thing that is found nowhere else in the rest of the Bible: the snake handling verses. These verses have gotten people killed for following them. If they are the word of your God is an evil God, out to kill his own followers for doing what he told them that they can do. You're really better off going with the majority view that these are completely unreliable.
There's no conspiracy here. Nobody's hiding anything about variants. People who think the Bible just floated down in the King James Version, and was handed to us might be shocked about this. But this is what textual critics do, is they examine different manuscripts and they try to assess either theologically sometimes, like your point was, or just, how early the manuscript is, or, different criteria. What's the most likely viable original writing?
And I find the fact that one must even do this to be strong evidence against biblical inerrancy. If the Bible really were inerrant, we should not have to wade through variants to try to find what was likely to be the original text. If there really were a God that revealed himself through this book, that revelation should be sufficient unto itself. We shouldn't need experts to figure out what the text was supposed to say, and other experts to tell us how the text is to be interpreted, and other experts to tell us how to apply it to our lives. If this really were a reliable book intended for everyone to be able to read and understand your God's truths from, there should be no such thing as a textual critic or an apologist. These things should be evident to all.
This is what textual critics do. In the vast majority of cases, we have incredible confidence that we have what was originally written down.
Maybe you do, Sean, but I sure don't.
There are some cases we're not sure about, and the debate is there. But I've also heard it said that the original wording is in a manuscript somewhere. We've just got to find it.
It's been nearly 2,000 years since your God allegedly walked the earth, and 19,000 years since the book was written. If your God hasn't gotten his act together yet and gotten us a copy of the book he allegedly wants us to live our lives by, there really is no other option than to ignore it. I mean, if we just wait, we will die waiting. Just live your life.
Fair enough. Now, I do appreciate you're not arguing for biblical authority here. You're not arguing for inerrancy. You're just basically saying, as a whole, is this ancient book reliable? And basically, if we think there's any ancient books that are reliable at all, we should think more so, that much more so, when it comes to the New Testament.
I thought I was done, but I really felt I needed to include this. Evidently, Dr. Shaw isn't trying to make a case for inerrancy or accuracy, merely that the New Testament is reliable, maybe more so than other ancient books. Cool. I can live with that. I don't live my life according to Homer or Plato. I don't memorize passages of Euripides. Ancient books, even great works, have little impact on my everyday life. They sit on my shelf and collect dust for the most part. Okay then, Sean? I'll do the same with the Bible and just live my life.